Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. A few days ago we did a show with my Scottish friend, Ewan Morrison, looking very much like Leon Trotsky, who talked about something called the AI wedge. It's part of his new novel, For Emma, a book about how technology is essentially getting inside us. It's the dystopia of Neuralink and the way in which now technology is essentially colonizing our bodies, becoming part of us. For some, of course, it reflects progress. For others, very much the reverse. What it seems to suggest, and particularly what Morrison discusses in his new book, For Emma, which has been acclaimed by the critics, is the end of private life. The idea of a self even might go away later in the 21st century with biotech and, of course, AI. And this theme of the private life, its history, its past, present, and future is the subject of today's show with my guest, Tiffany Jenkins, who has a history of private life out called Strangers and Intimates, The Rise and Fall of Private Life. Tiffany Jenkins is joining us from Hastings, just south of London on the south coast. Tiffany, congratulations on the new book, Strangers and Intimates. What exactly is private life?
Well, I wrote the book in a way to find out the origins of our modern idea of private life, a European and American idea. And I go back really to the 17th century, where the sense was that somebody should do nothing privately that they wouldn't do publicly. So that might be somebody who's really rich, living in a castle, or somebody who is really poor. This wasn't a kind of property-based private life. There was a sense in which you shouldn't do anything differently. And I chart it really from the 17th and 18th century onwards, where you begin to get a separation between a public life and a private life. And public life was the coffee houses, the newspapers, the embryonic political parties. And at the same time as that took shape, there was a sense of a private life both in terms of corridors and curtains and rooms with specific functions. The sense that private life is something important. And you see with the birth of the sort of novel in the 18th century, the values of the private life being imprinted on the page, the idea that you might have an inner life, romance, intimacy, something that is separate from the public sphere and something which is secluded and not dangerous anymore.
Yeah, I wrote a book. We were talking before we went live. I wrote a book about this about 15 years ago called Digital Vertigo, which covers some of the same subjects as you do in Strangers and Intimates, although focuses very much from a digital point of view. And I began the book with Vermeer's Woman in Blue, or Lady in Blue, this wonderful painting, one of the great masterpieces of Western art, which supposedly was produced in 1663. By Vermeer, which imagines a woman looking at a letter. And of course, what it does is fetishizes, if that's the right word, the idea of privacy. And of course, in socioeconomic and political terms, I always assumed this was bound up with the bourgeois, to borrow a Marxist word, of the bourgeois nature and values of the Dutch Republic. Is there some truth to that? Are artists like Vermeer in particular popularizing or pioneering the idea of privacy? And might it not be coincidental that these tend to be female characters?
They very much are valuing the private sphere. So it's striking in all those portraits by Vermeer that you have a real sense actually of the outside and the inside. So look here, that picture you've got on the screen, there's a map behind her, and I think she's probably quite close to a window. And yet you have this tremendous sense that it's still and it's quiet, and she's reading. So you have this sense of her inner life. It is often women. Women were very much more confined to the private realm as men went out to work or to enact in the public realm. So it is very much a sort of there is a particular female story. But I think what's striking about that picture is that it's not just prosperity. I mean, prosperity did, certainly in her case, enable the seclusion, but it's this sense in which private life begins in the mind. She's reading, she's having an internal conversation with herself. And I look at the battles really over private conscience in a very religious society in Europe, where you could believe and only believe one way of worshipping God. And it's in the struggles against that for both Protestant and Catholic that begin to get this sense, and you can really read it in people's writings of the time, this sense between what they're thinking and what they have to say, for sort of the public conformity where they have to, pledge allegiance to the King Henry VIII or follow the Pope. You get this division between your kind of internal mind, and that develops very much in conjunction with writing and focusing on scripture, but very much this sense in which there is an internal dialogue which nobody can have access to, and that's historically conditioned.
And of course, it's all bound up with technology. Many people have compared the invention of the printing press with the invention of the internet and its implications on technology. On privacy. We'll come to that later, Tiffany. But before we get there, your book is a history, and you've read everything and everyone on this subject. Is there any truth to the cliche that there was no private life in antiquity or in the Middle Ages, that it was Vermeer and the other architects of modernity that created private life? What existed? Was there privacy in Greece or in Rome or in the Middle Ages? Or anywhere else in, not just Europe, anywhere else in the world?
Well, in Athens, there was a strict division between public and private. So the citizens, the free men, a small number, were the ones who went out in public. All the images we have actually of Athens, the big buildings, the Acropolis, this is the public square, and it was highly valued. They very much relied upon women and slaves in a private sphere, in the oikos, to take care of all their needs, reproduction, work, etc., etc. There wouldn't have been any privacy as we would understand it, but there is in one of Pericles' speech a kind of a note that men are free to be free from surveillance in their homes. So it's not the sense of privacy that we would understand it, but I think there is this sort of embryonic leave us alone that you can see in that very early writings, but it's highly variable. So come the Middle Ages, you wouldn't have had privacy. People lived and died together. The very kind of sense of power came from people who you, if you think of somebody like, I'm thinking of kings and queens. So they wouldn't have had privacy. People near to them would have taken care of their toilet functions. It would have been a sort of badge of honor. Dressing in front of people, you see these sort of bedrooms of kings and queens and important people. They would have had people in their dressing rooms or in their bedrooms tending to all their needs. They would not have had privacy. It is a specific sort of privacy I'm talking about is specific to the early modern period, and it develops in stages. And I think it probably reaches its height in the Victorian period, when you have a very distinct separation between what happens in public and what happens behind closed doors. And what happens behind closed doors is kind of sacrosanct. it is very much off limits. That obviously has eroded again today. So that relationship between public and private is variable, but very, very important. It's probably the most important binary in our lives that we don't really think of in terms of a binary. But, you know, night and day, black and white, man and woman, public and private, these organize all aspects of our lives, from politics to intimacy to how we present ourselves.
Yeah, it's so central. It's so central. We just take it for granted. I'm thinking again of the Canterbury Tales or other early sort of late medieval texts. But I know this is a bit of a dumb question, Tiffany, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I mean, it's such a dumb question that it's almost embarrassing to ask. But I take your point on the absence of private life, or the value of private life in Athens or Rome or Greece or the Middle Ages. But here's the question. What took place in people's minds? What did they think about themselves? Was there no sense of self? I mean, when you read Socrates, for example, you get a very clear sense of self, that here was a man, Socrates, he lived and died. He, in fact, sacrificed his life for the Republic. Did people think of themselves as selves? And how could you have a self if you didn't have any privacy?
So having privacy, I guess, gives you a sense of the inner and the outer, which might give you a greater distinct sense of yourself. But I think, Athens was highly developed intellectually, politically, but you were very much part of the community. And I think if you were too much of an individual, you had to leave or drink hemlock.
Which he did, of course.
Which he did, yeah.
When he was given the choice of either leaving Athens or staying and dying.
But it's an interesting question, because I think you see the development of private life does happen in relationship to selfhood, a sense of self. And I think that's what Luther inadvertently did, is that he authorized the self as against, in his case, the Catholic Church. He thought he was following scripture, which he was, and therefore was granting authority to scripture, but it was his interpretation of it. And if you follow the debates over the kind of beginnings of a private sphere and its expansion, whether you're reading Locke or Hobbes, there's a discussion about two things. One is the realms of authority and the limits of authority. Certainly in Hobbes' authority, the Leviathan of his text was everywhere. And he asked royalists who he was speaking to be quiet, to be silent. But he did note that thought is free. He nonetheless thought that outside society, human beings were irrational, effectively. Hobbes comes along a little later, who argues for something that is equivalent to a bounded private sphere where people could follow their faith relatively freely compared to what came before. So the private sphere here that's being carved out is a way of dealing with religious diversity, effectively. But he talks about the self being a kind of a self-conscious thing with its own interests. So as you get on in time, the idea of the self is related to the beginnings of privacy. And then comes, say, the 19th century, where Warren and Brandeis wrote that really famous article, The Right to Privacy, in the Harvard Law Review.
Yeah, December
They're talking about
1890.
1890, yeah.
Privacy.
So far beyond, a long time after Locke, but they are talking about the modern self needing a place to retreat. So it develops in the idea in relationship to what we think we are, who we are, what do we need?
Right.
Do we, can we be trusted to live in a glass house, or do we need to be surveilled and monitored in case we do something bad?
Yeah, the modern, you put it beautifully, Tiffany, the modern self needing a place to retreat. And it's interesting you talk about Hobbes, because, of course, it's Hobbes's admission of fear and the private interest of fear and this collective idea that everybody is fearful. And the only way to address that is by creating a monarch or some sort of political authority, which turns the politics inside out. The politics then becomes an aggregation of private interests. Privacy then, not so much privacy, but private interests become the thing in itself determining politics. You talk about Luther as the key figure, and you note that he inadvertently changed everything. That it's a thesis which I think Weber develops also in Protestant Ethic and the Origins of Capitalism, although I don't think he talks much about Luther, more Calvin. What did Luther do that changed everything? How did he reinvent the self in the context of Christianity?
Well, there had been many debates about conscience and what it was, and there'd been many debates about then the universal church, but he pushed it a lot further, to the extent that he challenged the authority of the universal church, and it therefore then split into it. I mean, it fragmented, and once you fragment something, it continues to fragment. He did it by arguing that he was following scripture and shoving aside some of the intermediaries. So in that respect, it developed a more direct relationship with God, and probably developed, with the reading and the focus on scripture, a greater sense of interior life and interiority. So although the printing press was really important for these changes, it was his specific message, which is, don't trust some of these guys that are talking to you. Go straight to God. Go direct to God. The Protestants were not interested in a private life, it has to be said. They were interested in kind of being faithful and pious, but they advocated for greater intervention into private life. They obviously got rid of the confessional, which is a kind of quite a private relationship with your priest. Luther used to write to his friends, fear solitude, don't be on your own, because the devil will come to you and lead you into temptation. So he wouldn't have seen the consequences of his actions with anything but dread and horror. I think what happened then afterwards is because the authority of the Catholic Church was then thrown into question, you had a number of different competing interests fill the vacuum. And in England, there was a flip-flopping between Protestantism, greater Protestantism, back to Catholicism, then Protestantism. And as this was happening, and this is quite difficult, I think, for us to get our heads around. And we don't live in anything like the framework of meaning here in our society, whether we're in Hastings or San Francisco, is not religious. There are churches and people do believe, but then that was it, the complete framework of meaning. So when people are trying to follow because they think they won't go to heaven or hell unless they follow God truthfully, and they are developing a split between what they say publicly and what they say privately in their heads at a time when this was verboten to make a separation, you get this accidental split. Luther set it in motion, but other figures, Henry VIII, Thomas More, Catholics, Protestants, all of whom are creating their own private space to worship as they see fit, that accidentally creates this division. And then it's one of those things. It's very interesting that a lot of the writing of that period, people writing about kind of saying one thing publicly but saying another thing privately to God. They obviously find this terribly difficult, but they start talking about how to follow conscience, it actually means to follow this particular faith, follow the Puritans or follow the Catholics. You get these sort of networks of people privately and in secret going to mass when you wouldn't have been allowed to, when it would have been a kind of hanging offense. come the 18th century, people are then talking about conscience in terms of intimate relations. And it's a dramatic change.
Yeah, there was a very good, I'm not sure if you follow Melvin Bragg's show, In Our Time, the BBC show. He had a recent show on civility and the ideal of civility, or perhaps even what some people might call the ideology of civility, which very much comes out of this. You mentioned More. I've written and thought a lot about More too. Of course, More's most famous book is his Utopia, which some people see as a warning about all this. More was a representative of the Catholic Church, a reactionary, I guess, in some ways, a man with blood on his hands, a very controversial figure. I mean, nobody can see everything, but did More, do you think, more than others, understand the consequences, not just of Lutheranism and the Reformation, but its implications on the self and the complexity of the self? That seems to be, in part, what he's warning about in his great masterpiece, Utopia.
He knows that what Luther is doing is challenging the very idea of an authority figure, an overwhelming authority. And he's the first person to use anarchy in respect as a word, and he's doing it in respect of Luther. I don't know if he anticipates what it means for the self. He probably underestimated the self. I think a lot of people end up or begin by underestimating what people are capable of. That's why they think they need this overriding universal church or Leviathan, because without it, people will behave badly. They need to be monitored. Otherwise, all chaos or anarchy will reign. I mean, it's interesting that you talk about civility, because I think that's one way of dealing with living with strangers, which is effectively what you get in the 18th century, partly with the rise of mercantile society, but also the kind of the chaos of the religious wars and the blood soaking of Europe meant that as people came out of it, they needed to find a way to live together. And so politeness is one of them. This is a time when the handshake is developed. So people start thinking, how do we live in a society where we don't necessarily know our neighbors? And they start thinking about civility in that context.
You've obviously given this a great deal of thought. You've done a BBC series on the history of secrecy. Is secrecy a consequence of this? Was there such a thing, Tiffany, as secrecy before Luther?
Well, secrecy and to a degree privacy. I mean, these are quite protean concepts, and at times they mean the same thing. I think it's only in sort of the 18th century, 19th century that they begin to come apart in terms of their definition. They were seen in many cases as dangerous. There's all these passages in sort of 16th century books about how people walking in corridors and talking to each other in a manner where you couldn't hear them, that's dangerous. The sense that, I mean, obviously people did do it because there's all sorts of plots, and people, always have the need for some type of secrecy to say things that other people can't hear. But it was definitely seen as suspicious. And I think there's certainly cases of just being able to see people going away to watching people retreat to speak in private, speak secretly. And
what's that wonderful series on Henry VIII, the British writer?
The Henry Mantell, Wolf Hall.
Yeah, the Hilary Mantel, and the Cromwell figure, and that idea of sitting or standing in corners and talking quietly.
Yeah. And that's a wonderful series, because in both the book and the TV program, you get this sense of interiority. The thing that you can see with Mark Rylance, the Cromwell character.
The interior. So again, for moderns like us, Tiffany.
It's not a bad slip.
Yeah, well, you can claim to be Hilary Mantel. it's just such a weird thing as for us as a species, a modern species anyway, to imagine humans without interiority.
It is. I mean, some would say that we are losing it. I don't, people are probably a little bit apocalyptic about this sort of thing. But I think as a trait, as behavior, it is historically located. And so we do live in times where kind of projecting outwards is sort of, there's a certain cultural pressure. We are reading less, certainly books, diaries that people used to. So the Puritans start writing diaries in the 17th century as a note of how they pray. 18th, 19th century, it becomes more about their daily habits and reflection. And today, I think people take the notes that they take are, well, they're online, aren't they? Or they're on Twitter.
Right there. Our media these days is deeply confessional. Let's introduce the idea of the confessional in Roman Catholicism. Mm-hmm. I'm not a Catholic, so my knowledge of it is very much borrowed from traditional media, from movies like The Godfather. But was there an element of intimacy to the confessional in traditional Roman Catholicism, that you and your priest would talk and you would reveal your sins and your inner thoughts? How does the confessional play out in Strangers and Intimates?
I think that it is a very intimate relationship, because you're trusting that person to hold your secrets and your sins. You would have known them. They would have been, they would be an important figure in your community, an authoritative figure, but you'd see them every day. And you'd have to trust them not to tell people. And
so does that, in a sense, undermine your historical narrative that the confessional, I don't know the history of the confessional, but I assume it existed, from the Augustine Church onwards?
That's right.
This reflected a degree of privacy, even in traditional Roman Catholic life?
I think it's controlled. Probably there's a degree of controlled privacy. But my point is that society wasn't organized on that basis of having a separate private sphere that goes beyond, a one-on-one relationship, and is both the way society is structured and also valued. So at different times, you have a very distinct, separate private sphere from public sphere, and then it dissolves really in the 1970s. I mean, it's important to say.
The 60s, the 70s.
I think it's cumulative over the course of the 20th century. There are probably three processes. One is a kind of an intrusion of elites, the kind of the kind of more psychological interest that elites have in the individual as a way of either manufacturing consent or engineering consent. That's probably not as important as the way in which the character, as in the words of David Reisman, the American character, changes from an inner to an outer self. So the kind of the kind of rootedness of the American individual in the early 20th century in the family and in tradition, and in still a fairly religious society, begins to give way to a much more outward looking.
Yeah, and there's a whole school of Americans, Reisman, Christopher Lasch, Daniel Bell, all warning about this, probably in the same way, in a weird way, as Thomas More. Before we get to the 70s, and then, of course, digital and how that changes everything, I wonder if we could talk. I'm not sure if you have much of a discussion of Jeremy Bentham and utilitarianism in your book, but in my book on all this, Digital Vertigo, I wrote about 15 years ago, I see Bentham also in the central way of utilitarianism being this aggregation of our likes and dislikes, kind of beginning a crisis of the private realm, in the sense that if we can aggregate ourselves, then our private lives don't really matter. They can be quantified in the same way as the Musks and the Teals now are quantifying it with new companies like Neuralink. Do you agree? How does Bentham and the history of utilitarianism play out in your historical narrative?
Well, he comes up with the panopticon, and
right, and the idea that it can all be justified within this panopticon where everything can be seen and then people will behave themselves, kind of taking Hobbes to its logical conclusion.
And it's the idea of being seen that he sees as disciplinary, because you might not know if you might not be seen, but you think you're being seen. And it's originally for a prison, but he intended it for all sorts of.
And he was working for his brother Samuel, or he's working with his brother Samuel Bentham, who was working for Catherine the Great. So the sort of this enlightened despotism and maybe today's supposed enlightened despotism kind of go together.
There was also a degree to which I think it was a sort of behaviorist model, which is kind of, there was sort of at beginnings of the nudge, that if you nudge people this way, you nudge people that way. I think it's important to note that obviously his panopticon was never built. I mean, he thought it might be, but it was dismissed. But it was that kind of he
wanted it to be. I mean, it was his big project, and of course, out of all that, you get the French school of historical privacy. I know that you borrow some of your ideas from Philip Aries, who wrote a 5-volume history of privacy, and of course the ideas of Michel Foucault, who built glittering careers on these themes.
Yeah, but Foucault was understood very early on that the kind of the confessional, that kind of putting yourself out there might not be so empowering, and that it would invite surveillance. And I think he was together with Lasch and Bell, Tom Wolfe too, in their various ways, had quite important insights in that period, sort of late 50s and 50s to 1970s. I mean, the great counter to Bentham, I think, is his, I wouldn't say he was his protege, but John Stuart Mill,
right,
who broke from the Benthamites, the philosopher, and how he and Harriet Taylor sort of argued. They're often known for On Liberty, and he's claimed by all sorts of political thinkers left and right.
She may have written part of that, and his fetishization of Harriet, and again the interiority of the female, that Mill kind of seems as if he kind of half suggests that men aren't capable of that.
Well, he's still, I mean, they're Victorian, so I think, they're writing within the constraints of their time. But he wrote The Subjection of Women, or was it that? No, that was Wollstonecraft. What did he write about women?
The Rights of Women.
Right, exactly. And he campaigned for female suffrage. So I see him as pretty progressive when it comes to women. But they both argued for what they called experiments in living. So they argued for a private sphere, really, where people could experiment with how they wanted to live. And he also had a romantic strain to him as well, where he saw that sort of ability for people to be free, particularly in the private domain, as essential for moral autonomy. To be able to work on yourself and to take decisions about your life meant that you were a properly moral person. So I think he was much more trusting of what people are capable of, continuing in that kind of conversation about the self. I mean, there are lots of other 19th century writers, women, who are talking about the condition of privacy for women in that period, it could be very restrictive. A privacy for a woman is very different to a man when they're confined to their home. But you have people like Charlotte Gilmore Perkins, who writes The Yellow Wallpaper, really about being driven mad by being confined to their home.
Yeah.
And then there's Virginia Woolf, who writes about a woman needing a room of her own. So she definitely needs
separation.
Control. She needs separation. She needs to be able to retreat.
But the interiority is often treated in tragic terms. One thinks of Flaubert, Madame Bovary.
Yeah.
I mean, when romantics think of the
Yeah.
inner life, did they always think of misery? Could we be happy as individuals? Especially women, they always seem to be, I get into trouble
No.
here, Tiffany, but they always seem to be moaning about something or other.
Yes, I know. Well, I think they enjoy it. I think one of the
Hey, can I
things,
quote you on that? Women enjoy
yes,
moaning.
I think one of the things that happens is that the public world begins to be seen as inauthentic, and you see this actually with the sort of the Rousseau kind of vision.
Right.
The
Rousseau
great
is, of
man,
course, so important here, sort of
yeah.
central figure as well, along with Luther, Moore, Hobbes. I mean, it's incredible how Rousseau plays out here. Yeah, in the sense that, I mean, all this comes to the idea of the self and authenticity, and the only thing that is authentic is the self, which, of course, Rousseau champions.
Exactly. So the private self then overtakes the sense of the kind of the public self, if you like, which was a kind of the way people sort of talk about the public self in the 18th century is the civility, the polishing, the dressing properly. And Rousseau wants to kind of get rid of all that. He retreats to the forest, paid for by a female patron, of course, retreats to a forest, writes his novels, takes off his watch, and falls out with all the philosophies, the philosophers, the French philosophers. But I think effectively what you have is this sort of turning point where society is seen as a problem. Society is
and what's
seen as
interesting
kind
about
of,
Rousseau is that he fetishizes childhood, whereas again, historians have argued that childhood didn't really exist until modernity.
yeah.
But the more innocent you are, the more of a self you are. So with Rousseau, you have the idea that we're born with selves, whereas Locke's notion was that we were born without selves and we become selves through what we experience.
I think that's right. I mean, I think Rousseau assumes a certain
innocence, that it's somehow there's something about the innocence which defines us.
Yeah.
And we don't, and in Emile, then the whole point of education is not to get rid of that self.
He never talks about authenticity, but what you basically have hit with him is the birth of the authentic self, and this kind of fetishization of the private self, and that society is against it, rather than the way they'd sort of seen it before, which is society helps to polish the self because it gets rid of the hard edges and things like that. So society ends up being seen as all is false, is what he described it as, all false. And that's why he sort of writes his confessions about how he realized that it was a constraining influence.
Yeah, I know in your book you focus on Warren and Brandeis's famous Right to Privacy, the 1890 Harvard Law Review piece. Would it be fair to say that in the 20th century we've overdone it? We've gone the other way. And you see in books like, you see it in the Cold War, you see it in Orwell's 1984, that the biggest dystopia, the most terrifying thing is the destruction of the self. Because in 1984, everyone was being watched. And in Room 101, Big Brother got into our minds.
I think we do live in a period where there is little distinction between public and private, where the idea that you might keep something to yourself is seen as strange, as inauthentic. I think that's a problem, but I don't see it as this sort of top-down thing where Big Brother has come in and is watching us all the time. I think there's a problem in as much as states, in terms of tracking, it's partly because they don't quite know where the borders of the state ends, which is different to a Big Brother thing, if that makes sense. Right? It's not this
my point about Orwell is that he was trying to terrify us about particularly communism, but also fascism. That this is the worst thing that can happen, is that Big Brother will be watched all the time. There'll be cameras everywhere. It will be Bentham's panopticon, except more efficient. and there'll even be rooms where they'll know what we want. They'll get into our head.
I don't think that's what we've
fear,
got.
which was, of course, in Orwell's 1984, Winston Smith was rats.
I don't see it like that. I think that sort of top-down Big Brother talk is probably unhelpful. Which is not to say which is not to say I think things are fine. I think we do live in
I'm not saying whether Orwell was right or not. I'm simply saying that the centrality of 1984 as an influential text speaks to the way in which private life became sacred or is sacred, particularly in the Cold War.
I think it was probably a way of juxtaposing America, the land of the free, to Russia and China. And as they became, as you know, with 1989, those sort of values no longer held the same importance. I would say, though, that 50s and 60s, you have a very quite paranoid America. What was that? And there's a lot of anxiety about tech, Johnson's database, wiretapping. That is a bit paranoid.
Yeah, and the greatest movie of the 70s was The Conversation, which of course was about that kind of paranoia. And then when it comes to the Cold War, the most effective movie about East Germany and Soviet totalitarianism was The Lives of Others, which is a movie about being watched all the time. What about Tiffany, the theorists of the public in the 20th century, the theorists who push back on the primacy of the private? And I'm thinking in particular of Habermas and Arendt. How does that play out? There was a pushback against this fetishization of the private, and particularly in Habermas and Arendt, the prioritizing of the political.
Yes, I mean, Arendt obviously loves Athens, where you had the model of the Athenian citizen, where the political self, the one that is in the agora and making the arguments, that is her greater ideal society. And what's really important about Habermas, Arendt, and Sennett, actually, Richard Sennett's The Fall of Public Man.
Yeah. I think he's been on my show actually a few years ago.
Absolutely brilliant book. And they've got their differences between them, but they see in that period in the States, 50s and 60s, the disillusionment with the public realm, the disillusionment with politics. It's always worth remembering that the Christopher Lasch book, the culture of narcissism, the strapline to that is an age of diminishing expectations. So you have the sort of the shrinking of a public realm, and that people are just only really end up being interested in what they're eating, who they're sleeping with, their day-to-day habits, which won't change society, and end up being very, very limiting, almost like we're just animals.
So with the internet, I mean, Lasch, Daniel Bell, none of them are around these days, Arendt, Habermas. Do we see with the internet this sort of logical conclusion to privacy of people going on Instagram and X and all the other networks and telling the world about what they're eating, what they're wearing, what they're not wearing, what they're thinking? Are we seeing the logical conclusion of the age of privacy, in the sense that most people's lives are incredibly boring and no one really cares? Not even ourselves care about what we're thinking or doing. So we're seeing the sort of, we're going from, shall we say, Luther to Zuckerberg here? Am I being a little cynical?
Before the internet, there were television programs in the 1970s where people started to effectively broadcast their family lives. So there's this shrinking before the internet comes along. I think you can see it. I mean, The Truman Show, I think, is 1994.
Yeah, wonderful movie.
So, but it's before everybody is filming themselves. But they're already talking about this sort of a kind of surveillance society. The early webcams are people like Jennifer Ringley, putting her life online. She's a college student, 24 hours a day. And I think the conditions was already like that. Conditions for that were already in place. So I think the internet just accelerates and exposes what's already at play. The Christopher Lasch book's very interesting because this is the culture of narcissism. Often the kind of narcissistic individual is portrayed as somebody who is an egotist, this triumphant individual shouting about themselves. But he argues it's more like there's this fragile, minimal self that needs constantly to be recognized. And that's why they are effectively, and he's writing before the online world, that's why effectively they're always online, because there's a kind of desperation there, this need to be recognized. And I think that's quite an important insight that helps to explain changes in the self leading to this kind of voyeuristic demand for recognition. So the sort of self that we're seeing today that's constantly exposing their privacy is one that is needy, that can't in a way get recognition elsewhere, that's obsessed with the more banal parts of human existence. It's not a public self that's wants to talk about public achievements. It is what they're eating or drinking, sort of the quotidian aspect of being alive, or it's a self that needs safety. And that's where sometimes it meets state interests, a state that needs to surveil to check that we're not all terrorists or whatever it might be, and selves that feel like they need to be protected.
Arendt distinguished between loneliness and independence, suggesting that actually loneliness is something that you don't suffer from. She writes a lot about it. In our age of anxiety, Gen Z, there was a good Ezra Klein show featuring a young woman, Kyla Scanlon, on Gen Z and all the visibility you write about. Is there, in your view, a connection between what seems to be an epidemic of loneliness and this obsession with private life? Are Gen Z the unhappy generation because of this excess, this overabundance of privacy?
I think there are a number of things going on. Number one, this might seem a bit abstract, but I do think there is a crisis of meaning.
There's always a crisis of meaning, Tiffany, isn't there, throughout history? Yeah,
I think for young people in particular, you have to ask, what are they part of? Do they have do they see a future? I'm not convinced that they do. We don't have a future-orientated society. At the same time, we have a society that's often talks up the wrongs of the past. So I think they don't have a kind of tradition to look back to draw from. So they're kind of out of time. There's the other thing that we haven't quite talked about that I think affects everybody is the decline of civil society and the decline of the kind of intermediary institutions between family and state.
Yeah, and that's, of course, Arendt's theory of totalitarianism. So it's different from the decline of civility, although it's a consequence, is when you lose those intermediary institutions, the church.
So I would say, we used to talk about, with Robert Putnam's work in the
who's been on the show, on being alone.
So then the discussion was about the collapsing community and how to rebuild it. I sometimes wonder, loneliness, I sometimes wonder if we're pathologizing actually what is a social problem, which is a society where people are fragmented, not quite sure how to go beyond themselves, whether it's to belong to a church or a bowling group or whatever, and are fragmented and uncertain about the future. That I would see that as a social problem, and I'm not convinced by the discussion around loneliness, because I think sometimes it sort of turns that very real problem into something that's a problem with individual psychology.
Well, let's end. You've been very generous with your time, Tiffany. Let's end by going back where we started with you and Morrison's dystopian vision of the future of Neuralink, where everything is known about us, where technology has invaded us. Easy question to end with, Tiffany. You and I still, we're talking, we're throwing lots of ideas about the world at each other, but we don't know what's happening in each other's minds. We're still strangers in that sense. I have no idea of what you're thinking. You have no idea of what I'm thinking. By the end of the century, will we have technology that will mean that I'll be able to somehow access your brain and vice versa? Will we have some sort of networked brain, which is maybe what AI really is? And that easy question. And secondly, is that a good or a bad thing?
Well, it would be a very bad thing, because we need to keep our thoughts to ourselves, and then we need a private space in which to test them out together before we take them out into the public. And I'm deeply concerned with the way in which often today private conversations are so often leaked by all manner of politicians, policemen, and normal people. We need that it's absolutely essential to work it out, to test it in private before making it public. There's no way it's going to be technology that takes that away from us or makes our thoughts private. Tech can get as brilliant as it can be, but it will never do it. Ultimately, it's up to us to either give it away or reclaim it. Can't blame the tech. Tech isn't the problem, right? It comes down really to what sort of society we want to live in and how we want to be treated. That's not a technical thing. That's not to do with technology. That's to do with humans. So the solution is before us. And we can't just blame tech. Can't blame tech for this problem.
We can't blame tech, which is an unusual position from Tiffany Jenkins. Important new book. It's out both in the US and in the UK. Fascinating conversation, Tiffany. The Rise and Fall of Private Life, Not Public Life, Strangers and Intimates, your new book. Congratulations. And this is a subject which is certainly not going away. We'll have to get you back on, Tiffany, to talk more. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.